Now this band, which I've just realised I'd been putting before Elliott Smith and Patti Smith in my collection, that's ridiculous. There's an S on the end of it. It goes afterwards.
Rank the albums.
For such a brief career, this one is a mess in what we define as albums, partly due to the generosity and the tradition of between-album singles. This has resulted in a lot of tracks that aren't on the only 4 actual albums, and thereby a lot of overlapping compilations, of which I've chosen 2, the obvious early one and the most complete later one. These do also overlap. It's possible to be a big Smiths fan and think you've got everything now, and then find there's still some extra oddity in their very measurable and finite career to discover. Even this official complete compilation ain't actually complete, and makes the amazing decision to include 2 nearly identical compilation discs, just one of them with more on it. Maybe they should have just swapped one out that covers everything that's not on the others, but then there's radio sessions versus studio. It's arguable that this one isn't the right choice for ranking because it's a US release, but with international availability, there's not really such an argument now. It's got more to it than the UK equivalent. Despite only having 6 products involved, I'm not actually gonna stack the rank on camera because of the amount of trigonometry involved in deciding which is better than what, when there's all this overlap and technicalities. So the concept of the Smiths is when this uniquely poetic man decided he deserved a band and found a ridiculously proficient guitarist. An absolute maestro, very frontal about his influences, but he still invented a new way to be an indie guitarist that's prevailed and influenced everyone across the multiple generations since. As a teenager, Morrissey, starting out as barely musical, brings new things to the field of music through his naivety. And yeah, beside that, you need a sidekick who's just thoroughly practical and musical to execute it. We've also got a very funky bassist and a punky drummer, but he's undermined by how drums sounded in the 80s. Is it a drum machine, or did they just ruin drums to the extent that it may as well have been a drum machine? Declaring that is the 80s version of the auto-tune dilemma. Let me put something on screen about that. Okay, that's done. Anyway, cheers to those 3 guys in putting up with Morrissey, and thereby inventing the Smiths, one of the most influential bands there is. With the 80s production and the horrible track Miserable Lie, there's not much that's on the debut album that isn't done better in Hatful of Hollow. It's an odd compilation of singles, B-sides, and radio studio sessions, in which they make more convincing versions of the worthy tracks on here, so really this is the one you want. This almost may as well have been their debut album. It nails their template, but it also brings some more creativity, some more variety to their sound. As does the second album, on which Morrissey finally looks beyond himself to confront the suffering of others. This one's an odd decision, as I'd say there's not really any single track, unless you count How Soon Is Now, that's among their best here, and yet the greater variety and greater ambition sits atop the debut for me, especially if we're disregarding the debut because of Hatful, which I kind of am. It's escaped the lockstep of the Smiths' debut formula. There's more funk to it, and rockabilly, and just more ideas. And even without a singular shining track, it's just bringing the average up by being great throughout. And then there's the big one, ready to be confrontational and morose and cheeky to the best extents in every adjective you can apply to the Smiths, really. With the 1 per year schedule of albums in the 80s, the Smiths just happened to be at their best here. This is one that's so well known, I'm not sure I can say anything new about it, and I'm not sure anyone needs to hear anything new about it. You could just hear it. Then I think the reputation of The Queen is Dead is so vast that you can almost forget that there was another full studio album. After making something so monumental, there's a lot more room to dick around, and that's the energy of this one, and it's justified. This is silly after-party Smiths, making something that arguably didn't need to be made, but that gives it this unique levity that becomes its unique selling point. This confronts the reputation of the Smiths being a misery guts band, which really doesn't hold up throughout the music of the career. There's misery guts songs, there's misery guts lyrics, but it's still fun songs. I enjoy Misery. Okay, fine, it's misery guts, but it's good. And then to wrap up, an extensive celebration, mostly to highlight the things that haven't yet been on these discs, although with some overlap. The strengths of this are in how it's basically a best of, but without as much overlap as a best of would typically have with the albums. And its CD length, it's like twice the duration of any of their albums. By highlighting the singles, this maintains that levity. It's kind of almost the Smiths without the gloom. And yeah, this disc is the most sensible way to sweep up the best of the rest if you want to get them all on physical media. Who does that? It's not possible to get a comprehensive Smiths discography without repetition, and even if you rely on streaming, it'll still take a bit of strategy. Really, you could even skip Hatful because a lot of it is on Louder, which was sequenced to replace Hatful and The World Won't Listen for the US market. But by doing that, they've skipped the genius singles that were thrown onto the US mixes of the first two albums, so it's only actually redundant if you've got those there. Morrissey moved on to a career of bigotry with occasional music, and it's such a shame because he's really improved as a musician. He's a much better musician than he is a bigot. His bigotry's just so hazy and unfocused. Kinda intended to be deniable, but mostly just confused. For someone once so independent-minded, it's disappointing, even embarrassing to see him be such an incurious follower. I don't actually believe that Morrissey was less of an ass as part of this band. He just knew what was worth saying, to speak up things that hadn't been spoken instead of what was spoken by Enoch Powell. The inclusion we might feel from the Smiths could still be exclusionary to others due to the boundaries of his tolerance. He already decorated every release with a black and white photo of a white person, and that was partly an authentic reflection of the aspirations within working class culture, celebrating the real, the queer, the elegant, the gritty, the sensual, the hun, and partly reactionary jingoism that willingly dons the blinders to other oppressed groups. And those parts are not even definitively separate once you've romanticized it.